Well, we're going to look at a moment in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Let's set this aside just a little bit. It's another one of those one-of-a-kind passages. You read something here that's kind of personal to Paul. You'll never find it any other place. And you have to put it in context or it will not work properly. Nothing much works out of context. Everybody remember that? But the context is that Paul, at the end of chapter 11, was under attack. People were questioning his credibility. His letters and his voice, they say, were different. And he just wasn't up to what he should be. And so Paul comes along and says, I shouldn't talk like this. I'm going to tell you some things. You're a Hebrew, I'm a Hebrew. You're this, I'm this. And he said, I'm even more. And I have been in all kinds of dangers. I've been under all kinds of pressure. I've done all these things because of Christ and His work. So he's defending himself. Now in chapter 12, he continues this and puts a little different spin to it, but it's the same thing, only it's more powerful than being beaten 5 times. It's more powerful than being in prison. It's more powerful than being in shipwrecks 3 different times. It says far more than any of those things say. So it begins in verse 1. He says, I must go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained. I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. Now, I've had the beatings, I've had the shipwreck, I've had all that stuff. But let me go a little farther. Now I'm going to go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. And he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up into the third heaven. Now, who do you think he's talking about? He changes the tense of it, but who do you think he's talking about? He's talking about himself. He said, I know a man who was about 14 years ago, gives us a little timeline there, who was caught up into the third heaven. People everywhere have wondered, what does third heaven mean? I think most people end up saying it's where God is. It's where God is. Because the earth and the heavens that we know are these stars and so forth, and somewhere beyond that is God. I was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. In other words, I don't know if I was taken up in my body or not in my body. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I don't know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. Caught up to paradise. Now that's kind of an interesting word, special word, because who else used that word about paradise? Today you'll be with me in paradise. Who used that word? Christ used that word. He heard, this man I'm talking about heard inexpressible things a man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I'll not boast about myself except my weaknesses. Now I want you to pause for a moment and think about what Paul has just said happened to him. He's being thrust in competition by these people with what he calls super apostles. People like Peter, people like whomever. But did Peter ever get to have happen to him what's happened right here? Or did Matthew? Or did any of those other apostles? I mean, we say that to be an apostle you had to be an eyewitness of Jesus. We think on the road to Damascus, he had a conversation with Jesus. But maybe right here's where he saw Jesus, really. I was caught up into a third heaven. I saw things that man ought not to repeat, that can't be uttered. I don't know why he can't repeat them. But can you imagine the experience he went through 14 years ago? That he got to see into the paradise that we all long to go to. He got to see it. He got to see things that were so, I guess, wonderful that he doesn't talk about it. But we've often wondered, how could Paul survive the beatings? How could Paul survive the shipwrecks? How could Paul stay, as we say, in the saddle with so many hardships in his life? Well, all I've ever done has been told about paradise. That's as far as it's gone. I've been told about it. And so I've been called to live by faith, and you've been called to live by faith in this paradise. But what did Paul get to see? Though he preaches about faith all the time, he got to see it with his own eyes, so to speak. Whether he's in the body or out of the body, he doesn't know, and I don't know either. But God knows. But he got to see this place we all long for. Don't you think it made an impression on him that will never end? And don't you think it puts something in him that allows him to go through all this other stuff he goes through so that he can stay with it? It's a special thing Paul's talking about. We don't know of anybody else prior to death that got to do that and come back here and preach. And it's little wonder that he preached Jesus so strongly. And in fact, he says, that's all I ever preached. I preached Christ and him crucified. Because he knew that only by Christ we would get to go where? To that paradise that he's seen. And so, to me, it's just a really interesting passage. But I'll not boast about that, he says. And it's interesting he doesn't. How many times in Scripture has he told this story? We don't have it told another time that we know aware of. Not in these Scriptures. I'm not going to boast about that. If I'm going to boast about something, I'm going to boast about my what? My weaknesses. Verse 6, it says, even if I choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from this boasting. So no one will think of me more than is warranted. I'm not going to be a self-promoter. I'm not going to boast about what I do. Is that a good trait? Yeah. You know, I know some people that could boast about a lot of really big things, and they not ever mention it. They won't talk about it. They'll put it aside like it didn't happen. You know, they're not going to bring glory to themselves. Now, listen to what he says next, though, and this is kind of priceless too. To keep me from being conceited. Now, what does conceited mean? See, if you ever start down this deal of boasting, if you ever start down this deal of thinking about how good I am and so forth, you're going to get this part being conceited, kind of prideful, kind of arrogant. Like, do y'all realize how special I am? Have I told you lately what I've done here, and here? You know, it's that kind of thing. Paul said, to keep me from going there, because of the surpassing great revelations, there's been a thorn in my flesh. I mean, I could go around boasting about a lot of things, but to keep me from doing that, there's been a thorn put in my flesh. We don't know what that was. But we've been talking in James about troubles that will not what? Some of them won't. Some of them will not go away. Some of them will not go away. Paul apparently has some kind of problem in his body, in the flesh, that will not go away. It's there. Yeah. Some say his eyes. Some say it's his eyes, because it's something that he'll often have other people writing for him. I think it was gout. I think he had a chronic gout problem. And so, but I don't know what it was. He has something that he has to deal with constantly that's just a mess for him. And you're right, most people do think it has something to do with his eyesight, but we don't know that. It was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. So what kind of problem, what's the magnitude of this problem? It's constant and it's severe, because and he credits it to Satan, like he should, and it's a torment to me. If it was eyesight, I'm pretty familiar with that right now. Having to carry my dad around a lot, and others have to carry him too, but I've made the mistake of not grabbing hold of him, not telling him there was a curb there, and watched him fall flat on his face and mess everything up. I've made that mistake. Now I don't make that mistake any longer. But I know how I feel about it. How do you think he feels about it? You know, it is a never-ending dilemma that he finds himself in. Never stops trying to find this or that. But there are other things beyond that. Eyesight, that is a problem. What if you can't hear? What if you can't walk? What if there is a pain like Bo's been having, for example? It's been just constant. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, isn't it interesting that Jesus talked to him like this? I kind of wish he'd say something to me once in a while, kind of like this, so I can get some things cleared up in my head. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Don't you find that interesting statement that the Lord told him? Number 1, I know you got a problem. Number 2, I know it's a bad problem. It's tormenting you. Number 3, I'm not going to take it away. My grace, my goodness is sufficient. I've been good to you in bunches of ways. You don't have room to complain. And number 4, I don't mind you having a problem for this reason. Because my strength is being able to be shown out of your weakness. Now, does that give you a little insight as to why Paul will so frequently use those words, that I only glory in my weakness? Because God's glory is shown through his weakness. He's able to accomplish great things, not because he has the ability, but because God has the ability. I don't know, what a special attitude. To know and realize that I've got a thorn in my flesh, or I've got weaknesses, and yet God uses those who are weak. I think one of the maybe 3 most famous people in modern day times, at least, came out of Abilene Christian, was a guy who got his first 2 years at Lubbock Christian, was still a junior college, went down there. His name was Charles Seibert. Charles Seibert probably has spoken in more congregations of the Churches of Christ than maybe any other person in history. And he's spoken primarily to churches that are struggling in their leadership and struggling with church problems. He's been everywhere. But he never drove a single mile of it. I've been with Charles. He and I spoke on the same things. He never drove a single mile of it. To read, Charles would be like this, with special things on his eyes. He'd be reading like this. And Charles is dead now. Died at a fairly young age. But he was loved by many, and he accomplished great amounts of good for congregations. But he had major problems with his eyesight, and therefore his mobility, and so forth. And so Paul ends this little section by saying, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. Isn't that interesting? That is why I delight in the weaknesses, in the insults, in the hardships, in the persecutions, in the difficulties. I don't know about that. I don't know about that kind of language. I'm not going to say I delight in them. And I'm sure in the time they're slapping that whip across his back, he's not jumping up and smiling and saying, "Hit me again." But I look at this, he says, I look at life and look at all this, and I instead of moaning and groaning and complaining and whining and telling you how bad it is, I delight in this because, you know what? It's when I'm weak that then I'm strong. What does that possibly mean? If you're weak, you're weak. How can you be weak and be strong? Well, it's when I am weak that Christ is able, he just said right before that, to do what? To really work. So when I'm weak and I'm letting Jesus do the work, I'm letting God work, then I am what? Strong. So have you ever told God, I don't think I have the ability to do this? I'm not sure I'm going to get through this. You're going to have to give me the words to say at this particular time. And then you get there and somehow something comes out and it's decent, sometimes more than decent. And you have to look back and say, that was altogether God, that wasn't me. I was helped mightily in that. Everybody see who Paul is? He's a most interesting character. But now you see why. You see some of the background that makes him like he is. So anyway, we're going to stop there.
Sweet are the promises, kind is the word, dearer far than any message man ever heard. Pure was the mind of Christ.